the Republican establishment has lost control of the Republican Party. It is obvious from polling that the only candidates Republican Party voters are willing to consider are ones who heed closely to Donald Trump's ideology of despising neoconservatives, of opposing endless war, of denouncing the use of American money to fund what is intended to be not a war that Ukraine wins, but an endless war in Ukraine, not to save Ukraine, but to destroy it, at the altar of, for some reason, destroying Russia, things that benefit a tiny sliver of the population, politicians who stand up and advocate for the 2008 or 2012 version of Republican Party ideology like Mike Pence and Tim Scott and Chris Christie and Asa Hutchinson and Nikki Haley have been struggling to gain any traction at all because it's not the same Republican Party that it was for all those years under George Bush and Dick Cheney, and then John McCain and Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan and the rest of those corporatists and militarists. The reality is the Republican Party has changed, and now if you look at polling data, as we've shown you many times, it's Democrats who support the CIA and the FBI and the Union of State and corporate power to censor, while Republicans oppose that and the war in Ukraine. So the Republicans are desperately searching for somebody to take back the Republican Party, not just from Donald Trump, but from his movement, and reinstate it as a party that loyally serves the class of its large donor base. Now, Donald Trump did not perfectly adhere to that agenda at all. One of the very first things he did, in fact, that the Congress let him do was sign into law a gigantic tax cut for the largest corporations and wealthiest people, while doing very little at first for the middle class and the working class that he had vowed to serve. But rhetorically, he heeded to that ideology and in many cases followed through on it, though not always. He's saying he realizes his mistakes, that he's more determined than ever to cleanse out of the swamp of Washington the neoconservatives and globalists and militarists who have been ruining the United States and who ruined his administration because he let them in. And we'll see if he actually means that, if he wins. But clearly the Republican Party is doing everything possible to win back control. And they put their hopes at first in Ron DeSantis. But the combination of his lack of charisma combined with his hardcore culture war stances, which do not please most Republican donors who tend to be cosmopolitan and don't want to hear about LGBT causes or contempt for trans people or abortion issues even, and who are starting to become uncomfortable with Governor DeSantis for his refusal to criticize Trump as harshly as they want to, are looking for an alternative. And yet you see the people who are thriving and who are attracting attention, like Vivek Ramaswamy, who we interviewed as part of our trip to Milwaukee last week. You can watch that interview if you haven't already. It was a very interesting interview. We interviewed him the day after his performance in that presidential primary. Shows that the people who are attracting support are people with this anti-establishment mindset, or at least claim to have the anti-establishment mindset that Trump personified and gave voice to. And it seems as though the alternative that a lot of these establishment Republicans and neocons are now placing their hopes in is former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, in part because she did have a very strong performance at the debate. I was there, I watched it. I heard the applause from the Republican donor base, who are situated right behind the Fox News microphones, and the entire center stage of the floor of the debate is reserved for the Republican Party. Rumble was a sponsor of the debate, or at least had exclusive rights to stream it online. So we had very, very good seats. Because I was part of the Rumble contingent, I sat right behind people like Donald Trump Jr., Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Matt Gaetz, and other people of that kind who were also there as part of Rumble. They all have shows on Rumble. But the real seats, the best seats, are all reserved for Republican Party donors, for establishment donors, to ensure that the people whose cheering and booing you're hearing most are Republican establishment donors. Now, there are also people on the sides who are huge fans of Vivek or Governor DeSantis, and he has a lot of support among establishment voters as well, so you hear from them too. It's not entirely that, but they ensure that a huge part of how the debate is shaped is through the reaction of establishment voices. That was what Donald Trump pointed out in 2016 when he was being booed by the audience in the Republican debate for criticizing Jeb Bush, somebody who had no support among most Republicans And yet you would have thought Jeb Bush was the most honored and revered figure in the world based on the audience reaction because, as Trump pointed out, the audience was filled with Republican lobbyists and Republican donors who were backing Jeb Bush and who hated Donald Trump. Now, one of the ways Nikki Haley tried to distinguish herself, I think her most dramatic and effective moment was when she clashed with Vivek Ramaswamy and specifically stood up to defend Joe Biden's signature foreign policy, which is U.S. support for the war in Ukraine against Russia. Now, I think it's extremely weird that somebody would run for the Republican presidential nomination when it seems like the signature of their campaign is agreement with the signature foreign policy views of the other party's incumbent president. Usually, if you're somebody who really supports the foreign policy of the Democratic Party, go be like the Bill Kristol and David Frum and almost every other neocon in the United States and go join the Democratic Party or support Joe Biden's candidacy like most of them are doing. Why run and be Joe Biden's opponent only to agree with him on core foreign policy and even economic policy issues and only have mild clashes on the culture war? Yet that seems to be exactly what Nikki Haley is doing. So here's the clip of her in the debate where she clashed with Vivek, specifically on the war in Ukraine and foreign policy generally.
Of Governor DeSantis that you didn't appreciate it when he initially called it a territorial dispute. Why?
First of all, the American president needs to have moral clarity. They need to know the difference between right and wrong. They need to know the difference between good and evil. Right. When you look at the situation with Russia and Ukraine, here you have a pro-American country that was invaded by a thug. So when you want to talk about what has been given to Ukraine, less than 3.5% of our defense budget has been given to Ukraine.
Okay, just to be clear, the United States spends more on its military budget than the next 14 nations combined. And in fact, it spends even larger than the $850 billion figure that we're given. When you add on to that the budget for the intelligence agencies, it's probably closer to $1.5 trillion. So when you're talking about 3.5% of the defense budget, you're talking about an enormous sum of money. In fact, just to give you one example, in 2016, the Obama administration, with the Republican Congress, signed a deal with Israel, a 10-year deal, to provide Israel with what the New York Times just this week called a vast sum of money, $38 billion in American money that is transferred to Israel each year for 10 years based on the view that Israel is an important ally in the Middle East and therefore we have to support it. You know those arguments. Nikki Haley is a big believer in that. In just the first 18 months of the war in Ukraine, the Biden administration and the Congress under it, the bipartisan Congress, has authorized more than what the United States devoted to Israel for that 10-year package. That was a record-setting package that Netanyahu, despite his differences with Obama, was genuinely grateful for. It's unprecedented in terms of the amount of support that one country gives to another. And that's because of this special relationship that both parties insist on supporting between Israel and the U.S. Now, just this week, in fact, today, President Zelensky said he wants and expects the United States to have the same relationship with Ukraine that it has with Israel. Namely that it provides Ukraine with all the money that it needs to maintain a sophisticated and advanced military, and that it isn't dependent on which party wins. So Americans can't vote against it. Just like you can't vote against aid to Israel because they'll get it if Democrats or Republicans win. Zelensky wants that kind of guarantee from the United States as well. And so Nikki Haley's trying to say that 3.5% of our budget, our military budget, is a tiny amount. At the same time, she wants to cut Social Security and Medicaid and make Americans have to work longer and harder to be eligible for those benefits, to devote more of their life to their pointless jobs, because now she doesn't need Social Security and Medicare, nor do her children, because she's enriched herself with millions and millions of dollars of personal wealth by serving the very corporate and militaristic interests that are now financing this campaign so that she goes on stage and says these things. Let's listen to the rest.
If you look at the percentages per GDP, 11 of the European countries have given more than the U.S. But what's really important is go back to when China and Russia held hands, shook hands before the Olympics, and named themselves unlimited partners. A win for Russia is a win for China. We have to know that. Ukraine is the first line of defense for us. And the problem that Vivek doesn't understand is he wants to hand Ukraine to Russia. He wants to let China eat Taiwan. He wants to go and stop funding Israel. You don't do that to friends. What you do instead is you have the backs of your friends. Ukraine is the front line of defense. Putin has said once Russia takes Ukraine, Poland and the Baltics are next. That's a world war. We're trying.
Somebody show me where Putin said that after he's done conquering all of Ukraine, he's going to go to Poland and the Balkans next, even though Poland is a NATO country, and that would instantly mean war with the United States and all of Western Europe. This is a complete lie and fantasy that neocons always say in order to get you to continue to support wars, to try and scare you. That if you don't support this war, the new Hitler is going to come and invade every other country. But she's defending the Biden administration's policy in the last 45 seconds that she had an opportunity to speak and express what she wants Americans to hear about her campaign. She stood up to say, I'm here to support the Biden administration and the views of liberal Democrats when it comes to the war in Ukraine and our confrontational posture toward China, and not what conservative and independent voters want, which is no more of their money being sent to Ukraine. What is the point of a campaign like this? Who is she representing? Whose views? Obviously not the Republican Party's voters, who are against the war that she's so enthusiastically defending along with Joe Biden.
To prevent war. Look at what Putin did today. He killed Prigozhin. When I was at the UN, the Russian ambassador suddenly died. This guy is a murderer, and you are choosing a murderer over a pro-American country.
Okay, so before we hear from Vivek, I just need to say this. You probably remember that clip early in President Trump's administration when he was interviewed by Bill O'Reilly, who at the time was in that 8 o'clock spot on Fox before Bill O'Reilly was fired and Tucker took over. And Bill O'Reilly was pressuring Trump on Trump's campaign pledge to have a constructive relationship with Putin and Russia and not an antagonistic one, saying that we should work with Russia on defeating ISIS and al-Qaeda in Syria and other priorities that there's no reason to consider Russia an enemy of the United States. And Bill O'Reilly said, but how can you say that? Putin is a killer. He's a murderer. And Trump turned around and said, oh, you don't think we have our killers as well? You think we're so innocent? Look at what we've done in our history. So let's assume that it's true that Vladimir Putin killed Prigozhin 3 weeks after he led a battalion of 25,000 soldiers onto Moscow threatening a coup against his government. What do you think the U.S. government would do to somebody who gathered 25,000 extremely well-armed troops and marched on Washington threatening the government, shooting down American military helicopters and planes the way Prigozhin and the Wagner group did? Look at what the United States' government is doing to a bunch of Facebook warriors who never brandish weapons, who entered the Capitol for 3 hours for a largely peaceful protest that turned into a riot, putting them into solitary confinement. You don't think the United States would take action, military action, against somebody who led a coup, a real coup, not a fake one like on January 6th, inside the United States? The United States sent special forces into Pakistan without the knowledge or consent of that government on a mission not to capture Osama bin Laden, but to kill him. Not to arrest him, not to put him on trial, not to show evidence, to murder him, to kill him. Israel did the same thing after the 1972 Olympics when Palestinian terrorists abducted Israeli and other athletes. Golda Meir ordered the Mossad to hunt them down and kill them because she didn't think international institutions were acting quickly enough. And as for being a thug for invading other countries, there's not a single war in the last 20 years that Nikki Haley hasn't supported. Invasions of countries like Iraq and regime change wars in places like Libya and Syria and in Afghanistan. And so these Republicans who are cheering for her do not represent, as you can just look at polls and see, the foreign policy views of the Republican Party. They represent the foreign policy views of the Republican donor class that wants these endless wars, that believes in neoconservatism and wants to return to the pre-Trump ideology of the Republican Party.
First of all, Mr. Ramaswamy, you have 30 seconds. Mr. DeSantis,
Nikki, I wish you well in your future career on the boards of Lockheed and Raytheon.
I'm not on
but the fact of the matter, Boeing came off of it, but you've been pushing this lie. You've been pushing this lie all week, Nikki.
You want to go and defund Israel? You want to
okay, let me address that. I'm glad you brought that up. I'm going to address each of those right now. This is the false lies of a professional politician. There you have it.
Your watch, so the reality is, America less safe. You have no foreign policy experience, and it shows.
And you know what? The foreign policy experience that you all have shows in the pointless wars we've gotten into. I have to address that.
So that is that weird dynamic. I was there. I couldn't believe it. You hear these cheers for a person articulating views that the entire party, the actual voters of this party, reject. That's why they elected Donald Trump in 2016 while he denounced everything Nikki Haley just defended. This is a theater put on by large Republican donors and by neoconservative institutions to try to revitalize those ideologies that are now fully vibrant and supported in the Democratic Party and ensure that they're also supported by the other parties so that you have no choice. That's the project here. That's why she's defending Joe Biden's foreign policy, because she wants to ensure that foreign policy once again becomes bipartisan. So just like support for Israel and how Zelensky wants there to be a bipartisan package for aid to Ukraine, you can't vote. Your vote won't matter because the two parties are identical. They'll be the uni-war party. That's the project of her campaign. That's been the project of her entire political career. Now, when she was in the Trump administration, and then when she left, she often conflicted with Donald Trump on his foreign policy and acted to sabotage it. When she left, she often denounced it, precisely because Donald Trump was elected to expel the Nikki Haleys from the Republican Party. So here, just as one example, is a CNN article in 2019. Nikki Haley says Trump's Syria decision means leaving U.S. allies, quote, to die. In other words, Trump said exactly what he said when he was running in 2016 when Republican Party voters made him the nominee. Why do we have troops in Syria to overthrow Bashar al-Assad? We should work with Assad and the Russians to kill al-Qaeda and ISIS, but once we do that, we have no more reason to have troops there. And his view was ISIS was vanquished. There was no more reason to keep troops in Syria. Trump wanted troops out of Syria, but the Pentagon just ignored him. They would move them around, the troops, and lie to him and say that they had carried out his orders, and the media would cheer these people who were sabotaging the orders of the commander-in-chief because they believed the military had the better ideology of keeping troops deployed, even though civilian rule, the elected official who was the commander-in-chief, ordered them not to do so. They constantly applauded the people inside the government, subverting the elected president's policy in the name of democracy. That's how propagandistic they were. And Nikki Haley was one of the people constantly doing that. So here she is condemning Trump's attempt to try and leave Syria. Quote, Nikki Haley, President Donald Trump's former ambassador to the UN, issued strong criticism, stinging criticism of her former boss on Monday, saying Trump's decision to remove U.S. troops from northern Syria as Turkey plans a military offensive in the region means the U.S. is leaving Kurdish allies, quote, to die. The White House announced Trump's decision Sunday night following a phone call between Trump and Turkish President Erdogan. The move marks a major shift in U.S. foreign policy. And of course, Nikki Haley has spent her entire career serving establishment ideology and foreign policy. And so she was there to say, even though I was Trump's appointee who was there to carry out his foreign policy, I'm condemning any attempts to leave countries where we have troops deployed, even though that's what the Republican voters and ultimately the American people wanted when they elected Donald Trump based on his promises to do that. That's who Nikki Haley is. She does not care in the slightest about what ordinary Americans want. She cares only about what her donor class wants. They enrich her and they fund her campaign PAC. And that's whose interest she's serving. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.